Panellists LNG to Power Forum for North America. Earlier this morning in the first panel, we looked at the challenges that were facing new LNG projects, particularly in the US, especially from an ESG perspective, environmental, social and governance, which has become a major factor over the last couple of years and seems to be growing in importance all the time. They also, of course, face considerable uncertainty as to what will happen with US regulation in the Biden era. That should, of course, start to become clearer in the first few months of next year. However, projects will only go ahead if they can sell their output. And one of the reasons that we've seen few second wave projects moving towards FID is that that has become a struggle. So we're going to look at this in this session at where the most promising markets are. Two of them are absolutely obvious. China has been growing phenomenally quickly over the last 5 or 6 years and will continue to do so, especially as it moves towards trying to hit that 2060 target for climate neutrality. India has recently upped its target from 15% of primary energy to 25% of primary energy by 2030. The 15% looked hard enough to hit. 25% is extremely challenging, but it does present opportunities. And the question then is, can US and Canadian projects compete? Pakistan and Bangladesh promising new markets, not moving as quickly as they perhaps would like, because it's proving harder to get projects, regasification projects, to work in these countries than many assumed 2 or 3 years ago. Southeast Asia, a mix of established and emerging markets, and as a region, incredibly important. Middle East and Latin America, the question there is, are the boom years over? And it'll be interesting to see what the panelists have to say about that. And then, will Europe remain the market of last resort? Played a very important role this year. In fact, was more or less overwhelmed by the difference between demand and supply during the height of the pandemic. But we'll see what happens next year. It'll be very interesting to see what the situation is with Europe, and of course the interplay with the US as a swing producer. I'd now like to hand over to our moderator for this session, who is Langtry Meyer, founder and chief operating officer at Texas LNG. Langtry, over to you.
Good morning. I pass it over to Riley, who is our moderator.
Yes, don't worry about it. Thank you so much, Alex, for that introduction. Oh yeah, don't worry about it. Really appreciated having put that in context, that kind of globe-trotting span that you have in terms of just the number of different markets that North American LNG exporters could potentially sell their output to. I'm Riley Smith, Policy Advisor for Global Gas and LNG at the American Petroleum Institute. I want to first thank everyone for tuning in to our panel this morning. Our panel is the last one that will focus on the broader topic of North America's role as an LNG supplier to global markets. And we're going to wrap up that discussion focusing on which markets look to be the most promising for North American LNG exports over the next couple of decades or so. In other panels later today, you'll hear about the trends that are helping to open new markets, such as advancements in LNG import technology that make it economical for small markets to import LNG. But yeah, that's the how. Our panel this morning is going to focus on the why. Why are certain countries tapped to be important markets for North American LNG exports over the next couple of decades? And to help us answer this question, we're joined by 3 speakers whose wealth of experience in the LNG industry gives them a lot of insight into this exact question. Their full bios are available on the event page online, so I'll just introduce them by name and title so we can go ahead and get the discussion started. First, we have Langtry Meyer, previously introduced by Alex, founder and chief operating officer for Texas LNG. Next, we have Sarah Bairstow, who is chief commercial officer for Mexico Pacific Limited. Sarah is also joining us from Australia, so thank you so much for staying up late to be part of the panel. And last, but certainly not least, we have Nick Fulford, head of gas and LNG at GaffneyCline. Thank you all to the panelists for joining us this morning, especially very, very early in the morning for some of our panelists. As I mentioned, ours is the third panel that's part of the broader topic of North America as an LNG supplier to global markets. The scene has been set to some extent already, but I would like to turn to Nick first to give us just a quick macro market summary of 2020, up till now, December 8th. What developments over the last 12 months are critical to us understanding which markets will be the most promising for North American LNG exports going forward? Nick, to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Riley, and hello, everybody. Well, no one can deny that 2020 has been a momentous year in many respects. And so it's easy to think of many of the headwinds being faced by the LNG sector today as being COVID related. But of course, if you look a little bit deeper, things are much less straightforward. So there's no doubt that the lockdown caused a huge drop in demand for oil and was the main cause of low oil prices. Gas, on the other hand, already in trouble at the start of 2020, even before the pandemic began. Really, the problems for gas started a whole year earlier with the effects of an oversupply that's been building for several years, really, starting to affect the price. So as you look back from the start of 2019 to the start of 2020, gas prices, price indices really more or less halved during a time when actually oil prices were relatively stable. They halved again during the first half of 2020, culminating in that extraordinary few weeks where delivered gas prices in both Europe and Asia were actually below where Henry Hub was trading, something I never thought I would see. Not surprisingly, many of the US exports projects responded with curtailments and cargo cancellations, which reached the peak in August. Now, as if that wasn't enough, compounding the commercial decisions to curtail, we also had 3 very significant hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico in August and September, 2 of them effectively scoring a direct hit on the highest concentration of LNG facilities on the Gulf Coast. But really, in a testament to the resilience of those facilities, they came back up relatively quickly, albeit with some continuing grid power supply issues, which required a bit longer to address. But thankfully, both demand and pricing has picked up since then, and we're seeing out 2020 with gas prices really higher than at the start of the pandemic. In fact, as we approach the end of 2020, we've got Brazil, India, Pakistan, China, all looking at record demand levels. We've seen just now $8 prices in Asia for next month, over $5 in Europe. And while those levels aren't stellar compared to the last peak in prices back in October 2018, they're much closer. And in fact, as a ratio to oil prices, Asian gas is back trading at around oil parity. And amazingly, when I was looking at the numbers yesterday, I was very surprised to see that gas is only traded at this sort of level compared to oil in winter 2016 and winter 2014 in the whole of the last 10 years. So I think that tells us all we really need to know about whether LNG has a positive outlook for 2021. I think very much so. Having said that, it's not all plain sailing for gas, and one of the biggest clouds on the horizon is of course, carbon intensity, which I've already heard a lot today at today's event. The US is very much in the crosshairs for both European and Asian importers now, looking to appease consumer concerns about climate and sustainability, as Alex was saying. And I know this is something we'll be returning to not only in our session today, but in other events, other parts of the event. Anyway, that's my 2 pennyworth to start with, and back to you, Riley.
Great, thanks so much for that, Nick. So Sarah, kind of now turning to you, Nick did a great job of laying out for us where the North American LNG industry currently stands, right, after some really unprecedented pressures buffeted the industry earlier this year. I want to turn to you next. Before joining NPL, you were head of LNG marketing for the Gladstone LNG project in Australia. So you have a really good perspective on the Asia Pacific market and demand dynamics there in general. And kind of just following on from Nick, what do you see as the supply opportunities for North American LNG going into 2021 and post-COVID?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Riley. And it's a pleasure to be part of this series. It's been really interesting. The Asia Pacific market, I think everybody's aware of the story. It continues to be the engine room for LNG demand, and it's largely behind the doubling in LNG demand between now and 2040. As a region, it represents 70% of current demand, but also 70% of growth to 2040. So it really does continue to be the center of growth for the market. And that's really driven by, what we look at as 4 key regions within the Asia Pacific market. The first is that Japan, Korea, Taiwan market, very traditional market there. While there's only moderate growth looking out to 2040, they are seeking LNG for portfolio supply to assist in bringing demand through emerging markets to the market. But they also have a phenomenal level of contracts that are expiring between now and 2030. It's over 70 million tons of contracts that either have supply that those suppliers have depleting reserves or aren't able to backfill those projects, or it's simply too expensive. These are contracts that were signed in 2013, 14, when it was all 14 to 15% JCC linkage. So that's actually still, despite moderate growth domestically, it is still a really key target market for North American LNG. Then there's China. China, we're all too familiar with that China gas growth story. Huge demand going from just over 60 million tons of LNG in 2019, doubling to around 130 million tons by 2040. And that's really underpinned by growth in their power and industry demand, residential and commercial sectors, together with the material levels of coal to gas switching that they're targeting under their blue sky policy, and as they move into carbon net neutral targets for the country. And then the final 2 regions are what we group as the Asean and the South Asian markets. These are markets, South Asia is India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, for example. ASEAN includes Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, a lot of those markets in the southern regions. There's a lot of GDP growth in those markets. LNG is really being driven in terms of demand by power and industry demand, but there's also equally a lot of coal to gas switching opportunity and a market that's really focusing on LNG to power. So there's a really great opportunity for the LNG market in North American supply there. But those emerging markets do need support in bringing that demand to market. We're seeing many of the IOCs and more traditional buyers partnering with these markets for that very purpose. So each of these regions, while admittedly they are and they do remain sensitive to pricing, they continue to need LNG for energy security purposes, with many of those countries having little to no indigenous reserves at all, or facing reduced domestic or international pipeline gas availability due to neighbouring country reserve depletions. So they're looking for LNG that's reliable and affordable for energy coverage for their countries. And in doing that, we see them applying a pretty consistent criteria. There are 3 criteria we see them applying. Pricing remains key, and that's all about who can offer the lowest landed price. They're not so much focused anymore on dollars per tonne. I think that back in 2015, 2012 to 2015, when we saw a lot of the Australian projects carry quite a high dollar to tonne ratio, there was a lot of focus on bringing those costs down. But the North American model has been very successful in doing that. But buyers today, they want to know how much it will cost to get that LNG to their home shores. And at MPL, we leverage Permian gas at a liquefaction point that's close to those Asia Pacific markets to achieve the lowest landed price of LNG globally. So North America can be competitive, and we think it will share a good slice of that demand opportunity. The second criteria is flexibility. Asia Pacific buyers in particular have been moving away from that point-to-point model to more of a portfolio model for quite a number of years now. That's nothing new. Destination flexibility remains important. They want to control the destiny of their ships to be able to balance their portfolio in terms of supply to different regions. But if 2020 has taught buyers anything, it's that volume flexibility is critical if they want to be able to respond to unforeseen demand fluctuations and secure incremental value through portfolio balancing and optimization. And I think it's really important for the audience to understand that the North American market is really one of the only LNG markets that can offer that. By leveraging liquid gas markets, North American projects can offer material volume flexibility that integrated gas to LNG projects just cannot match because they don't have those alternate outlets for gas. And the third criteria is really that certainty of supply. Given the energy security reliance on LNG in this region, these are markets that can't afford to take a punt on whether and when that LNG will be available and arrive on home shores. There's increasing congestion. We've seen it over the last month in particular around the Panama, Calcasieu Pass, and delays due to weather events that we're seeing buyers actively seek out as a result US gas and LNG from the West Coast as a means of reducing shipping costs, reduce it by almost half, and also avoiding those key congestion points, which unlocks and de-risks US LNG into those markets.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Sarah. That was wonderful. Langtry, Sarah kind of really, I like kind of how she framed like those three criteria that differentiate kind of North American gas market and producers in terms of LNG. Speaking from the perspective of Texas LNG, how do you see North American LNG producers really being able to capitalize on this demand that she mentioned in the Asia Pacific? And how is it that North American exporters, she touched on someone differentiate themselves from other suppliers, but I would love to maybe kind of hear your perspective on that as well.
Sure. Thank you, Riley. Well, prior to the era of US LNG exports, LNG buyers had limited flexibility. Sales contract terms were rigid. Buyers were locked into long-term take-or-pay contracts with limited or no rights to cancel cargoes or adjust volumes. There is no destination flexibility. Oil index pricing was the norm. And so oil prices are volatile. And during high oil prices, LNG buyers paid a premium for LNG. Well, the advent of US LNG exports has changed the LNG market paradigm. And this has greatly benefited the LNG buyer with greater transparency, flexibility, and access to abundant, stable, and low-cost gas supply. So what makes the US LNG market unique? Well, unlike typical integrated LNG projects in other countries that include the upstream gas production, the US already has a well-developed gas value chain, including gas production, pipelines, gas trading hubs. And so this developed US gas infrastructure facilitated the rise of independent first movers such as Cheniere and entrepreneurial industrial development companies such as Texas LNG that represent the second wave. So this enabled US LNG export companies could focus on constructing efficient, low capital cost and low operating cost liquefaction facilities. And the US Gulf Coast has the lowest construction costs in the world. And so it's really the tolling model pioneered by Cheniere and other first wave LNG producers, which provided LNG buyers with flexibility and what ultimately is a transparent cost plus model. US LNG buyers have access to multiple sources of low cost feed gas supply. There's freedom to contract with multiple gas producers, gas marketers and pipelines companies, and even the optionality to produce their own equity gas. The US market offers liquid gas on gas market hubs and a range of risk management and hedging tools. If you look at US gas prices, they're expected to remain low and trade in a narrow and stable price band. And this gives greater certainty to LNG buyers. US LNG buyers have total destination flexibility and even the right to cancel cargoes. So the LNG buyer needs only pay the liquefaction costs and need not pay the feed gas or pipeline and shipping costs. So this flexible option worked very well. And we saw about 175 cargoes canceled in 2020. So this system works well. To conclude, the US LNG business model provides LNG buyers with much greater flexibility and transparency compared to the traditional rigid model that is prevalent in many other parts of the world. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Langtry. So thank you to the panelists. We now kind of we've set the scene. Sarah, I want to turn back to you real quick. Let's cut to the chase. You have a lot of insight on Asia Pacific. You mentioned the big five there: Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and then since the mid 2000s, India and China, that have really dominated the LNG imports in the region for the last 20 years. I'm curious if you see those demand dynamics changing, and kind of, or do you see the big five continuing to dominate as you mentioned, but what about some of the new entrants? Are they going to be gaining more importance? And I think what's particularly interesting about this these kind of changes that you're seeing in the region is that it's kind of different per market in terms of what the end use of the gas is actually going to be. So, do you see industry driving demand growth? Do you see power generation driving demand growth? I would love just to kind of get a little bit more in depth into kind of what you're seeing from your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we do see those key sort of 5 players plus the emerging markets around Asean and South Asia continuing to really drive that demand there, particularly when we're focusing on the Asia Pacific market. And there's a lot of focus on obviously net neutral carbon targets and coal to gas switching and how these economies can move into that sort of environment. But then there's also, as we mentioned before, that security of supply element. And so, while I think we've touched on some of the drivers around industry and power continuing to drive these markets, China, I think, is differentiated a little in that it's got a huge residential and commercial drive underpinning a lot of that demand growth as well. This is a market that has huge demand for LNG. I mean, if you wrap the numbers around it, the LNG market it was 360 million tons last year. It's doubling to 750 million tons by 2040, with that market rebalancing mid-decade. And I think we'll continue to see those key markets contract. In 2020, we saw the short-term market enter a period of shock, really, following OPEC's decision earlier in the year, and then, of course, the pandemic. It's important to acknowledge that, I think we've been anticipating this oversupply for quite some time. We've known that would happen around 2019 to 2021, and that was a result of the wealth of LNG projects taking FID earlier last decade. But, I think that 2021, we see that being one of the largest LNG contracting periods in recent times, with the macro environment really pushing buyers to enter into long-term contracts again. And those key 5 players, together with the other emerging markets through Asean and South Asia, will really bring those to market. With the market forecast to rebalance mid-decade, buyers are focused on ensuring that LNG is actually available across that supply shortfall period. We all know that LNG facilities take 4 to 5 years to finalize development and sanction, to build and then bring to market. And these projects need long-term contracts to meet financing hurdles, particularly in North America. So a failure to sanction those material levels of new supply across 2021 and 2022 will result, we feel, in a market shortfall of close to 90 million tons by 2030. And these buyers in particular, with that security requirement, they can't afford to let that happen. If you look at the spot market purchases as a percentage mix of portfolio supply for buyers in Asia, it typically only comprises around 10% of their total supply. I don't think a lot of people know that, and that's really across a period of historically low spot prices, right? So it's not like they're going to want to take all the more spot exposure over a higher price period. So if LNG spot prices rebound, if we look at this to the market today, to over 8 million tons, $8 an MMBTU for the front month today, and Brent's recovered close to $50 a barrel despite a pandemic and despite a well forecast oversupplied short-term market, it's easy to see why buyers want to ensure additional supply comes to the market. They want to avoid critical supply shortages and keep pricing affordable. And the only way they can do that is through contracting long-term supply. And in fact, I would go so far to say that we've already started seeing them do that. We've seen multiple 10 to 15-year SPAs, largely driven out of the Asia Pacific region, signed over the past 5 months alone. So the buyer's need for this LNG and those key 5 players, together with the emerging markets in Asia Pac, it's irrefutable that they need this LNG. It's simply a matter of who do they buy that LNG from. And we believe North American LNG is positioned to play a really large part in that contracting activity.
Great, thank you. Langtry, I know you're particularly interested in what you're seeing in Southeast Asia as well. What markets there do you find especially promising, and what makes them stand out for a company like Texas LNG?
Sure. So, from the perspective of Texas LNG, we're a second wave project. So we expect to be producing LNG from 2025. We really see that the Asian LNG markets have the greatest demand and growth potential. There are really 2 segments. You've got the large and mature markets in Northeast Asia and the emerging and high growth markets in Southeast Asia. So let me just give you a few highlights on how we view these different markets. If you look at the established markets, Japan, we see lower demand growth, and we even see Japanese LNG buyers looking to create new sources of demand and create other markets for their surplus LNG, such as Vietnam. So, from our perspective, I think going forward, I think in Japan, there's going to be an increased focus to low carbon LNG, especially given Japan's 2050 carbon neutral goals. In Korea, we see continued development of gas-fired power plants to replace coal and nuclear, and the GenCos can procure directly from the global LNG marketplace. Korea will always represent for Texas LNG somewhat of a home market, because Samsung Engineering is our strategic partner and is a shareholder in Texas LNG. So this gives us very, very good access to Korea, which we'll focus on. In terms of China, it's a market I've spent a lot of time in. Texas LNG was a member of the President Trump state visit back in 2017, part of that trade delegation. Reforms continue to open up the gas sector. Pipe China, which was created early this year, enables new entrants access to LNG import terminals and pipelines, so they don't have to build it themselves. And this is lowering barriers to entry and facilitating growth of the Chinese market. So I think the key question for China is, given the trade friction, is China a viable market for US LNG exports? And we just recently, heard that CNOOC has been placed on US sanctions list. I remain optimistic, and I think we're seeing glimmers of hope, in a trade revival. Recently, Foran Energy agreed to purchase LNG from Cheniere. And the fact is, US and China are natural partners. China being the largest importer of natural gas, US being the world's largest natural gas producer. LNG trade is the interest of both nations. So again, perhaps LNG trade can be carved out of this broader trade dispute. So if we, looking at Southeast Asia, Vietnam in particular represents, I think, an excellent case study for large integrated LNG to power markets. So why is Vietnam an attractive market? Well, power demand is increasing 10% a year. Vietnam is struggling with declining domestic gas production. And also the government is familiar with a BOT structure, I think, which can be applied to these massive integrated LNG to power business model. There are at least 5 major LNG to power integrated projects with over 20 gigawatts of power, multi-billion dollars worth of investment, big US sponsors such as ExxonMobil, GE, AES, Bairstow. Also, I think it's worthwhile noting that US foreign policy supports Vietnam, and really it's seen as a counterweight to China's influence. And US is promoting growth in Vietnam's LNG sector through the Japan-US Strategic Energy Partnership, the JUSEP, which was signed in 2017. In fact, last week, I attended the trilateral Vietnam-US-Japan LNG Forum, sponsored by JUSEP, and US and Japan have pledged to provide financial assistance to Vietnam for the construction of LNG-fired power plants and receiving terminals. So I think that we can see this model supported by US foreign policy rolled out and expanded to other nations across Southeast Asia, which is really positive for the development of LNG markets. And with that, I'm just really looking forward to when we can travel again and get back on the ground in these interesting markets.
Thanks so much, Langtry. I agree 100%. I used to cover Southeast Asia in my former job, and I think it's really fascinating to see the opportunities you have, especially in the energy sector in those markets. Nick, I want to bring you back in to the conversation. Of course, we would be remiss to leave Europe out of this discussion. As we heard from Sarah and Langtry, There's a lot of interest in the Asia Pacific because historically that's where the largest LNG importers have been. However, both last year and so far this year, Europe has been the largest importer of US LNG. Do you see this as a continuing trend, and what other developments should we keep an eye out for in the European market?
Thanks, Riley. And well, perhaps the place to start in Europe is exactly where Langtry finished off with respect to Asia, which is US foreign policy. Places like the Baltic, the Balkans, other parts of Eastern Europe, traditionally very much part of, well, exclusive recipients really of Russian gas, waking up to the potential for low-cost LNG coming from the US. Lithuania, of course, came to this realization a few years ago now, and countries like Latvia and Estonia are now actively pursuing LNG import options. Just this month, the brand new FSRU arrived at the Kirk LNG import terminal in Croatia. It's opening up a whole new array of potential customers and creating opportunities for US LNG exporters and obviously other LNG suppliers too. So as somebody who kind of grew up with the gradual liberalization of the gas sector in Europe, starting with Britain really in the mid-1990s, spreading to Northwest Europe in the decade that followed, I kind of continue to marvel at the way in which the US LNG exporters have sort of disrupted US thinking on LNG and gas generally. So there's no doubt in my mind that the emergence of the US as a major gas exporter has had at least the same impact from the wave of contract price innovations that has brought to the rest of the world, as it has really from the 60 million tons or so of LNG that frankly surfaced in little more than a blink of an eye in LNG terms. However, unlike in the US, in many parts of Europe, state controls, state influence continues to have quite a significant effect on whether or not commercial agreements are put in place. And the further east you travel, of course, the more this applies. Now, while private capital has wholeheartedly embraced this kind of new age of LNG in the US, it's a very different picture in Europe and indeed most parts of Asia. And this can slow things down quite considerably compared to the relatively quick decision-making that US businesses tend to embrace right across the spectrum. But of course, the results can still be very positive. Having said that, as we've already touched upon, the third-party access terminals of Western Europe, Isle of Grain in the UK, for example, Gate Terminal in Rotterdam, they've been at the forefront of this kind of new, very commercial way of thinking in Europe, which reacts, as we've seen, to price signals and commercial levers very, very effectively indeed. The other feature of European LNG markets is that increasingly LNG is being used in new ways, particularly on the smaller scale end of the business. For example, bunkering for ships has become a very well-established growth business for most of Europe, including the Baltic and the Mediterranean, as ports and ship owners adapt to the new restrictions on the burning of diesel and fuel, and also, of course, as customers start to embrace the low cost of LNG compared to those competing fuels. So one of the biggest growth areas has been in the use of smaller LNG vessels, which can both deliver fuel to ships and also supply smaller, sometimes barge or land-based LNG storage facilities, often allied to power generation facilities. So as the regulatory situation in Europe tightens up and as the cost of efficiencies of LNG starts to establish it as a lower cost option, what that means is that, of course, more capital can be deployed in things like break bulk and smaller scale facilities, which hasn't really been previously the case. Has to be said, this year, Europe has very much been the savior of the US export industry. Effectively, they've turned back pipeline supplies and have been absorbing these huge quantities of LNG. And this has brought utilization rates for many of the European terminals to levels never before seen. So in 2020, more than 40% of, I think, US LNG exports will have ended up in Europe. And by the end of December, that'll probably amount to around about 80 more cargoes than last year. So that's something close to a 40% increase. Now, of course, not everything in the garden is quite so rosy as we look forward. 2020 also brought with it some disappointments and perhaps some warning bells for the future. So staying with two of my earlier points, state controls, carbon intensity, we saw a very high profile rejection by the French government of a planned import contract that was based on US shale gas, mainly citing carbon issues as the reason. So this is, I think, really the tip of the iceberg as we look at the carbon questions going forwards.
Yeah, and that actually segs perfectly into kind of what I want to focus on for the last part of the panel here. Nick, just going back to you, what is your take on the rapid emergence of the carbon footprint, right, as a consideration for those countries that are importing North American LNG? And I hate to ask you to be a little bit brief, because I also want to open this up to get Sarah's perspective on what's happening in the Asia Pacific, and then also give Langtry a chance to talk about kind of Texas LNG's approach as well. So just if you can kind of give me a quick, kind of the high points of what you see as kind of, or your take on this trend.
Sure. Well, yes, obviously, as carbon intensity in the energy transition is starting to shape LNG markets quite significantly going forwards, we're all witnessing these kind of unprecedented levels of policy pressure to promote renewables in preference to gas for power generation. Although it remains to be seen how Europe can maintain grid stability and address intermittency from solar and wind in their electricity supply mix. We've seen several firsts in 2020, with some LNG cargoes even being offered up on a fully neutralized basis from the carbon produced in the production and processing of LNG right through to the carbon released on combustion. We've also seen cargoes sold on a less offset basis. It's worth spending just a few minutes to discuss what this all means for the LNG value chain and the economics. It's very interesting. All the initiatives we've seen this year to neutralize LNG have relied on nature-based offsets arising from things like reforestation and other ways to absorb CO2, really in the same amount as the LNG process and the burning of gas that produces it. So just to do a little quick study here, I mean, a typical LNG cargo involves around 250,000 tons of CO2, right from the wellhead to the burner tip, potentially more depending on the source of the gas. So with nature-based offsets going for around $10 a ton, that's around $2.5 million per vessel. So if we think back to our $8 spot price next month, that compares to around a $30 million value of the cargo. So really the difficulty comes where nature-based offsets, which really aren't intended or indeed capable of being a long-term solution for the gas industry, are no longer appropriate, and CO2 removal and storage becomes necessary. And of course, frankly, in some locations, if you don't address the carbon, then it's the tax that you end up paying instead. So for most projects, depending on such things as proximity to a carbon storage facility or a market for high purity CO2, the cost of carbon removal and the long-term storage can easily fall into the $50 range or even $100 or more. And the recent NPC study goes into that in a lot of detail, and you can find a lot of those that background on our website. So based on these estimates, the conclusion is that carbon neutralization could represent a cost or investment really similar to the entire gas value chain today, with the huge investments in LNG plants. And of course, that's a game changer for the industry and an issue that it needs to address today or early in the life of any new LNG project, really. But the fact is that these costs of dealing with carbon apply right across the board. And if you take hydrogen, for example, a huge amount of press around hydrogen, a lot of interest and investment in a kind of hydrogen value chain. But as you look at the economics of that too, it represents a step change in energy and power costs, and something that consumers will have to reconcile in future years. Now, of course, as well as governments, financial institutions are responding as well. And, a number of the big European-based typical lenders to LNG are starting to look at restrictions around the carbon intensity of the projects they lend to. So I think that'll be a factor going forwards too. But with that, I'll hand back to you, Riley.
Great, thank you, Nick. I do want to pop over to Sarah just really quickly. Are we seeing these same sorts of considerations in Asia Pacific? And then right after that, I would love to just kind of hear very quickly. I know Langtry wanted to mention something about the Texas LNG project in particular too.
Yeah, I think that Nick hit the nail on the head in talking about ultimately cost, and cost is essentially price for LNG buyers. And we need to acknowledge that there's no one global response that can be applied across all carbon emitting markets. It's a really dangerous approach, and one that will place global targets and the time to reach those targets at risk entirely. The Asia Pacific region and the markets within it, particularly those emerging economies, are a prime example of the need for that nation by nation approach. We can't expect them to apply the same transition targets, that rapid nature and at any cost that we're looking to expect out of Europe, for example. These emerging markets, they already face comparative energy, economic and social inequalities, and it's just not going to fly with them. So in those emerging nations, we need to adopt a path that allows them to transition in a manner that also supports economic growth for those nations, to support economic and social improvement for their people. And so they get behind this push for net neutral carbons, because we haven't seen, I'm sure everybody's noticed, a lot of targets being announced out of these emerging markets. Rather, I think, though, we need to acknowledge that while initiatives such as coal to gas switching could be seen by some as lower hanging fruit, there are actually initiatives that are capable of being actioned by these emerging markets in Asia and capable of incredible sweeping carbon reduction outcomes. So I don't really see the same lens being applied by Asia Pacific buyers as perhaps European buyers do to LNG life cycle emissions out of North America. As a region today that remains so heavily reliant on coal, which is one of the greatest contributors to global carbon emissions, Asia Pacific nations, they can achieve far more through coal to gas switching than anyone would by tweaking or reducing life cycle LNG emissions. They see LNG as affordable, and affordability is key in those regions. And importantly, it's an integral step to achieve their transition targets.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And Langtry, lastly, just to you, how is Texas LNG taking these considerations into account? And I hate to have to ask you to be very brief, but I know you wanted to highlight this in particular.
Yeah, no, thank you, thank you. Look, it's unmistakable. Low carbon LNG is an emerging trend. There's a growing pressure on LNG sellers to reduce their carbon footprint and produce cleaner LNG. And I think we've heard very well from Nick about the economics and the carbon neutral goals around the world. A question is, what can LNG sellers do to reduce their carbon footprints? And the typical way that we're seeing recently is investing in renewable energy projects or forestation. And this costs a lot of money. I mean, other ways, we need to work with our upstream gas producers to reduce flaring or to capture carbon. But what I would like to really highlight, okay, to conclude, is how Texas LNG is able to reduce its carbon footprint, and doing so without spending extra money here. Texas LNG is green by design, and Texas LNG is able to reduce significant carbon emissions because we use electric motors, and we're able to procure renewable energy such as wind and power. So the typical LNG plant, almost every plant in the world, burns natural gas to generate power for the facility. And as a result, almost every plant has a large amount of emissions, a large amount of CO2. Texas LNG, when we engineered the plant, we made the strategic decision to use electric motors so that we can take power from the grid and power our facility. As a result, our facility has very, very insignificant emissions. But I think where it really kicks in is we have a choice of how we procure that power. And in South Texas, you have an abundance of wind and solar power. And so the point is there's no extra cost incurred because of our green design. And so to conclude, low carbon LNG is a trend that will continue to grow. And LNG producers, such as Texas LNG, that are able to develop competitive price, low carbon offerings will differentiate themselves from other LNG producers and really position themselves favorably in this emerging low carbon world.
Great. Thank you to all the panelists. As I mentioned at the top of the panel, I think our discussion has helped clarify that crucial question of not only which markets look to be promising for North American LNG exports in the coming years, but why those markets look to be promising. I want to thank everyone for tuning in, and note that the next panel will focus on whether post-COVID economic stimulus packages will accelerate the energy transition. We hope to see everybody there. Have a good day, and once again, thank you to our panelists.